Dust covered the roads leading out of Ur when the first separation began, and the pattern never truly stopped after that moment. Across the wide plains of Mesopotamia, beneath skies that watched empires rise beside the Euphrates River, a man walked away from familiarity without understanding the full weight of what constant loss would demand from him. Abraham did not begin his journey with conquest. He began with removal. Geography itself became the first instrument of separation. The distance between Ur and Canaan was not symbolic. It was brutal, measurable terrain stretching across trade routes, deserts, hostile territories, and uncertain settlements. Every mile carried him farther from stability. The chosen in Scripture were rarely introduced through possession. They were introduced through departure. Again and again. The biblical record moves through maps marked by exits, wilderness crossings, famines, forced migrations, betrayals, funerals, ruined cities, abandoned homes, shattered expectations, and long periods where the future remained hidden behind silence. The story of the chosen was never anchored in permanence. It was anchored in movement. Abraham lost his homeland before he ever saw promise. Joseph lost his family before he ruled Egypt. Moses lost Egypt before leading Israel. David lost peace before receiving a throne. Elijah lost comfort before hearing the whisper at Horeb. Jeremiah lost reputation before speaking to kings. Paul lost status before carrying the message across the Roman world. Even the ministry of Jesus unfolded through constant movement, between rejection and departure, from Nazareth to Capernaum, from Galilee to Judea, from wilderness roads to occupied Jerusalem. The pattern remains startling because Scripture repeatedly ties divine purpose to the collapse of earthly security. The chosen are almost never introduced during stability. They emerge through disruption. Ancient roads become corridors of loss. Entire regions become theaters where separation unfolds layer by layer. The Bible does not hide this reality behind polished language. It traces it geographically, historically, and chronologically across centuries. Abraham entered Canaan only to face famine. Joseph rose in Egypt only after slavery and imprisonment. Israel escaped Pharaoh only to wander in deserts where an entire generation disappeared beneath wilderness sands. The chosen walked through landscapes marked by disappearance. At times, the losses were material. At times, relational. At times, emotional. At times, deeply public. Yet the historical progression remains undeniable. Every major biblical movement contains subtraction before expansion. Before Israel entered the Promised Land, Egypt had to disappear behind them. Before David ruled Jerusalem, caves and exile defined his existence. Before the apostles carried their message into the Roman Empire, Jerusalem itself became a place of danger, persecution, and scattering. The roads of Scripture are filled with people leaving one reality before understanding another. Constant loss became intertwined with movement because the chosen were continually pushed forward through instability. Geography reveals this pattern with unusual clarity. The wilderness of Sinai was not simply a barren location between Egypt and Canaan. It became a historical corridor where dependency replaced certainty. The wilderness stripped away Egypt gradually, painfully, relentlessly. Generation after generation vanished beneath the desert horizon until a new people emerged prepared to cross the Jordan River. Even the map itself tells the story. Egypt represented structure, food, and predictability, even in bondage. Sinai represented exposure. Canaan represented fulfillment, still waiting beyond conflict. The chosen often lived longest in the middle territory, the place between what was lost and what had not yet arrived. That middle territory became one of the defining environments of biblical history. Jacob understood this pattern while traveling between lands after deception fractured his family relationships. David understood it while fleeing across Judean wilderness strongholds under Saul's pursuit. The prophets understood it while watching nations collapse around them. Loss followed movement because movement itself became necessary for transformation. The biblical narrative repeatedly shows that permanence can create attachment strong enough to prevent transition. The chosen were often removed before they were elevated. This sequence appears across centuries with relentless consistency. Consider Joseph standing in the distance between Hebron and Egypt. The geography alone explains the magnitude of the loss. He was not merely separated emotionally from his family. He was transported across international boundaries into one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Caravan routes carried him southwest toward Egypt, while his father mourned in Canaan, believing him dead. The chosen one in that story entered purpose through betrayal, slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and isolation. Every stage removed another layer of control. Yet the biblical timeline presents those losses as connected stages within a larger movement unfolding across generations. Egypt later became both salvation and bondage for Israel. The same territory that preserved Jacob's family eventually enslaved their descendants. Scripture constantly reveals how temporary security can transform into captivity. Because of this, the chosen are often uprooted before attachment becomes permanent. Moses himself embodies this movement with extraordinary precision. Born under threat, separated from his Hebrew mother, raised inside Pharaoh's household, then forced into Midian after killing an Egyptian, Moses spent decades existing between identities and territories. Egypt rejected him. Israel initially doubted him. The wilderness isolated him. Yet Horeb became the place where calling emerged from obscurity. Loss was not incidental within his story. It defined the chronology. His journey moves from palace to desert, from prince to shepherd, from exile to deliverer. The biblical record repeatedly follows this structure because the chosen are historically shaped in transitional spaces rather than secure environments. Even Elijah's path across Israel demonstrates the same reality. During national apostasy under Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah moved constantly through drought-stricken regions, wilderness territories, hidden ravines, and foreign lands. The brook Cherith dried up. Zarephath became temporary refuge. Mount Carmel became confrontation. Horeb became retreat and revelation. The prophet never settled into earthly permanence because the mission itself required continual movement through unstable conditions. The chosen in Scripture are often geographically displaced because history itself is advancing through them. Their personal losses become connected to larger movements unfolding across nations and generations. Jeremiah experienced another dimension of constant loss, while Jerusalem moved toward destruction under Babylonian pressure. The city itself became a living symbol of collapse. Streets emptied, leadership fractured, the temple faced ruin. Jeremiah watched the slow death of the kingdom while carrying warnings nobody wanted to hear. His losses were not isolated private experiences. They unfolded publicly beside the collapse of an entire civilization. Yet even there, the biblical narrative preserved movement beyond destruction. Exile routes toward Babylon became part of Israel's prophetic timeline. The chosen often witnessed endings before they witnessed restoration. This pattern intensified during the ministry of Jesus. The Gospels unfold geographically through continual movement across Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Decapolis territories, fishing villages, Roman roads, synagogues, mountainsides, and hostile cities. Crowds gathered and disappeared. Followers arrived and departed. Public celebration transformed into rejection with astonishing speed. Even the triumphal entry into Jerusalem moved steadily toward betrayal, arrest, crucifixion, and abandonment. Scripture does not conceal the loneliness surrounding that progression. The chosen one at the center of the gospel narrative experienced rejection from religious authorities, misunderstanding from crowds, betrayal from a disciple, denial from a close companion, and abandonment during suffering. The geography of the Passion itself reveals movement through escalating isolation. Gethsemane, the high priest's courtyard, Pilate's headquarters, the road toward Golgotha, the tomb outside Jerusalem's walls. Every location marks another layer of separation. Yet Christianity itself later spread through similar patterns after the resurrection. Persecution scattered believers outward from Jerusalem into Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome. The message expanded through displacement. Entire missionary journeys recorded in Acts reveal the chosen constantly losing comfort, safety, stability, and familiarity, while history advanced through roads, ports, prisons, synagogues, marketplaces, storms, and trials. Paul's life especially demonstrates how constant loss became intertwined with expansion. Once deeply established within the religious structure of Jerusalem, Paul eventually crossed the eastern Mediterranean world, facing imprisonment, hostility, shipwreck, beatings, and repeated rejection. Cities became milestones of hardship and transformation: Damascus, Antioch, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, Caesarea, Rome. Each stage carried loss, yet each stage also advanced the historical movement of the message into new territories. The chosen in Scripture often appear to lose constantly because their lives are attached to movement larger than personal comfort. Stability becomes secondary to historical progression. The biblical narrative repeatedly frames loss as transition rather than finality. Still, that transition never appears painless. Scripture consistently records grief with remarkable honesty. Abraham mourned Sarah, Jacob mourned Joseph, David mourned Absalom, Naomi mourned her family in Moab. The exiles mourned Jerusalem beside Babylonian rivers. Loss remained real even when purpose existed beyond it. The chosen were not emotionally untouched figures moving mechanically through history. They felt the weight of separation, uncertainty, betrayal, and delay. Yet the historical pattern continued forward across centuries because the biblical story is fundamentally a story of movement. Eden was left behind. Noah crossed floodwaters into a changed world. Abraham crossed regions toward covenant territory. Israel crossed deserts toward Canaan. Exiles crossed into Babylon. Pilgrims returned toward Jerusalem. Apostles crossed seas into the Roman Empire. Scripture unfolds through journeys marked by continual transition. And transition almost always required some form of loss. The chosen go through constant loss, because biblical history itself advances through separation, movement, refinement, and reorientation. The road never remains still for long. The map continues unfolding. One territory closes while another waits beyond the horizon. One season collapses while another begins forming quietly in distant places not yet visible. Throughout the biblical narrative, the chosen repeatedly stand inside that difficult territory between disappearance and fulfillment, carrying the weight of endings, while history continues moving forward around them across deserts, kingdoms, rivers, mountains, prisons, storms, ruins, and roads that stretch far beyond what they can fully see in the moment. Jerusalem stood at the center of countless losses, long before its walls finally collapsed beneath invading armies. The city itself became a living timeline of separation, conquest, restoration, rebellion, and mourning. And through every generation, the chosen carried the burden of watching familiar things disappear, while history continued advancing toward purposes they could not yet fully understand. The biblical world repeatedly reveals a painful reality hidden beneath the movement of nations and prophets. The chosen are often positioned closest to transition zones where old structures begin dying before new ones emerge. Because of this, they experience endings earlier and more intensely than those around them. The losses surrounding them are not random interruptions within the story. They are often signs that a larger shift has already begun beneath the surface of history. This pattern appears across nearly every major biblical timeline. Noah lost the world he knew before humanity restarted beyond the flood waters. Abraham lost certainty before covenant territory emerged. Joseph lost freedom before preservation came to nations. Israel lost Egypt before inheritance became possible. David lost normalcy before kingship arrived. Daniel lost Jerusalem before standing inside Babylonian courts. The chosen repeatedly entered periods where visible stability vanished while unseen preparation quietly advanced in the background. Scripture consistently presents this progression geographically. Entire territories become symbols of transition. Egypt represented bondage, but also familiarity. Babylon represented exile, but also preservation. The wilderness represented exposure, but also transformation. Patmos represented isolation, but also revelation. The chosen often encountered their greatest moments, not in secure environments, but in locations shaped by separation and uncertainty. Consider the Babylonian exile in detail. The destruction of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a military event recorded within ancient history. It was the collapse of an entire national identity. The temple burned, the walls fell, the royal structure shattered. Families were uprooted and marched hundreds of miles northeast toward Babylon, across harsh terrain, stretching through Syria and Mesopotamia. The chosen living through that period watched sacred places disappear behind smoke and distance. Psalmists later described the sorrow of sitting beside Babylonian rivers, remembering Zion. Geography intensified grief. Exile was not symbolic language. It was physical removal from homeland, memory, and familiarity. Yet within that loss, another historical movement quietly unfolded. Daniel rose in Babylon. Ezekiel received visions near the Kibar River. Prophetic timelines advanced toward future restoration. Once again, the chosen were positioned inside the collapse before understanding the full meaning behind it. The Bible repeatedly shows that constant loss often precedes expanded vision. Daniel himself embodies this reality with remarkable clarity. As a young exile taken from Judah into Babylon, he lost homeland, language environment, cultural familiarity, political independence, and likely family security. Yet the courts of Babylon later became the setting where prophetic revelations concerning empires, kingdoms, and future ages unfolded before him. The chosen frequently lose the smaller world they once understood before being positioned to perceive something larger. This pattern explains why biblical journeys are filled with long seasons of instability. The chosen are often being separated from narrow definitions of security, while history pushes them toward broader assignments. Elijah experienced this after Mount Carmel. Victory did not immediately produce peace. Instead, Jezebel's threat forced him southward through wilderness territories until he collapsed beneath exhaustion and despair. Eventually, he arrived at Horeb, the mountain already tied historically to Moses and covenant revelation. Scripture deliberately connects geography to spiritual progression. Horeb was not random terrain. It represented historical continuity between generations of chosen servants who all passed through isolation before renewal. Elijah lost visible success, public momentum, and emotional strength before hearing the stillness that redirected him toward the next stage of history. The chosen repeatedly encounter moments where triumph unexpectedly gives way to isolation. The Bible does not portray this as failure, it portrays it as transition. This same pattern continued into the ministry of the apostles after the resurrection. The early believers in Jerusalem initially experienced unity and rapid growth, but stability did not last. Persecution emerged, Stephen was killed, believers scattered through Judea and Samaria. What appeared to be devastating loss became the mechanism through which the message spread geographically into new territories. The chosen lost centralized safety, yet the movement expanded farther than it could have otherwise. Biblical history constantly advances through scattering. The map broadens because people are displaced. Philip traveled toward Samaria and later along the Gaza Road. Peter moved between Jerusalem, Joppa, Caesarea, and Antioch-related developments. Paul crossed Asia Minor and Greece through exhausting journeys shaped by resistance, imprisonment, storms, betrayal, and danger. The chosen continually lost comfort zones because the mission itself demanded movement beyond familiar borders. Even Rome, the imperial center dominating the Mediterranean world, eventually became another stage for chosen servants experiencing separation and uncertainty. Paul arrived there under guard, not triumph. The chosen often enter major historical moments through chains rather than applause. Scripture preserves this pattern because it reveals something foundational about how biblical history unfolds. Human beings naturally attempt to remain where life feels stable, predictable, and controllable. Yet the biblical narrative repeatedly shows divine movement occurring through disruption. Abraham would never have reached Canaan without leaving Ur. Israel would never have crossed the Jordan without leaving Egypt. The gospel would never have spread through the Roman Empire without persecution scattering believers outward from Jerusalem. The chosen experience constant loss, partly because they are repeatedly moved ahead of the wider historical transition occurring around them. They feel the breaking first. They experience the separation first. They enter uncertainty first. The biblical record also shows that constant loss strips away illusions about permanence. Ancient cities once considered invincible eventually collapsed. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Dynasties faded. Armies marched across territories only to vanish into history themselves. Assyria dominated nations before crumbling. Babylon ruled empires before Persia overtook it. Persia expanded before Greece emerged. Greece fragmented before Rome ascended. Daniel's visions outlined this progression centuries before later empires fully unfolded across history. The chosen living within these transitions learned repeatedly that earthly permanence is fragile. This realization intensified their dependence on movement, guided beyond visible circumstances. Moses could not remain in Midian forever. David could not remain hidden in caves forever. The exiles could not remain permanently in Babylon forever. The apostles could not remain indefinitely in Jerusalem forever. Biblical history keeps moving, and the chosen are repeatedly carried through painful transitions as part of that movement. The life of Jesus presents perhaps the clearest example of this pattern. His ministry unfolded through continual departure. Crowds gathered, then disappeared after difficult teachings. Cities welcomed him temporarily before hostility intensified. Even close disciples struggled to understand the direction of the journey. Galilee eventually gave way to the road toward Jerusalem, and that final movement carried unmistakable momentum towards suffering and separation. The Last Supper itself unfolded beneath the shadow of imminent loss. Gethsemane revealed emotional isolation. Arrest brought abandonment. Peter's denial exposed relational fracture. Crucifixion displayed public humiliation outside the city walls. Yet even the resurrection narratives continue emphasizing movement. The women ran from the tomb. Disciples traveled roads toward Emmaus. Instructions pointed toward Galilee. Later, the apostles would move outward across nations carrying the message farther than Jerusalem alone could contain. Christianity expanded geographically because the chosen refused to remain frozen within grief. Loss remained real, but movement continued. This tension defines much of biblical history. The chosen are not portrayed as emotionally detached from what disappears around them. They mourn deeply. They grieve cities, people, homes, hopes, and seasons. Jeremiah wept over Jerusalem. David mourned Saul and Jonathan. Jesus wept near Lazarus's tomb and later over the city itself. Scripture consistently validates sorrow while simultaneously pushing the narrative forward into the next stage of unfolding history. Constant loss does not mean the chosen are abandoned. It means they are often positioned at the front edge of transition, where old realities are dissolving before new realities fully emerge. The Bible repeatedly frames this process through journeys because journeys naturally involve leaving one location before arriving at another. The uncomfortable middle territory becomes unavoidable. Wildernesses, deserts, seas, exile routes, mountain passes, prison cells, and storm-tossed waters all become recurring environments where transformation occurs while visible stability disappears. The chosen are shaped there because those environments expose what cannot survive the next stage of the journey. Fear surfaces there. Dependency surfaces there. Identity surfaces there. History itself seems to slow within those spaces, yet the biblical narrative later reveals that those difficult territories were never meaningless pauses. They were preparation zones hidden inside larger movements stretching across generations. The chosen go through constant loss because Scripture presents history not as static settlement, but as unfolding movement guided through transitions that often dismantle visible security before revealing greater purpose beyond it. From Eden to exile, from Sinai to Jerusalem, from Galilee to Rome, the biblical world keeps moving through roads marked by separation and renewal, and the chosen repeatedly walk those roads carrying the weight of endings, while unseen chapters quietly begin forming beyond the horizon. The final movements recorded in Scripture unfold beneath the shadow of kingdoms trembling, cities shifting, empires weakening, and history accelerating toward fulfillment that still remained partially hidden from human eyes. By the time the later writings of the New Testament emerged across the Roman world, the chosen had already passed through centuries of recurring separation. Entire generations had watched homes disappear, rulers rise and fall, temples stand and collapse, and familiar systems unravel beneath forces larger than themselves. Yet the biblical narrative continued revealing the same underlying pattern with remarkable consistency. The chosen often walk through repeated loss because their lives are tied to movements extending far beyond immediate comfort, immediate understanding, or immediate reward. Their journeys unfold historically, geographically, and prophetically across terrain where permanence rarely survives for long. Rome itself demonstrated this reality powerfully. The empire stretched from Britain to the Near East, controlling trade routes, military roads, ports, taxation systems, and provincial governments across enormous distances. To ordinary observers, Rome appeared immovable. Yet the apostles carried a message insisting that even the greatest earthly powers remain temporary within the larger progression of history. The chosen lived inside that tension daily. Many believers lost livelihoods, social acceptance, legal protection, and personal security as suspicion and persecution increased within various regions of the empire. Some were imprisoned, some were scattered, some disappeared into martyrdom beneath imperial authority. Yet Christianity continued advancing geographically because the chosen repeatedly carried the message beyond the boundaries of personal safety. The roads of Rome became channels through which suffering and expansion traveled together. Paul moved across those roads under constant uncertainty. Peter ministered under growing hostility. John eventually received revelation while isolated on Patmos, a rocky island in the Aegean Sea, associated with exile and separation. Once again, the chosen encountered revelation not through worldly stability, but through displacement. Patmos stands as one of the clearest examples of biblical isolation, transforming into expanded vision. Removed from public influence, separated from churches he loved, John entered an environment defined by distance and confinement. Yet there, amid isolation, the final prophetic panorama of Scripture unfolded before him. Mountains, seas, cities, kingdoms, judgments, and future restoration appeared within sweeping visions crossing heaven and earth. The geography of exile became the setting for revelation concerning the future of history itself. The chosen repeatedly lose smaller securities while being drawn into larger realities. This pattern reaches back through every major biblical era. Noah floated above a destroyed world before new beginnings emerged. Abraham wandered foreign territories before covenant generations appeared. Moses crossed deserts before Israel entered inheritance. The prophets watched kingdoms collapse before restoration unfolded. The apostles endured scattering before the message spread across nations. The Bible consistently frames loss as part of transition between historical stages. The chosen are often caught directly within those transitions because their lives intersect with unfolding movements that reshape generations. Even the structure of Scripture reflects this momentum. Genesis begins with humanity leaving Eden. Exodus centers on departure from Egypt. The historical books follow migrations, wars, exiles, returns, and kingdom shifts. The Gospels move steadily toward Jerusalem and the cross. Acts follows expansion outward from Jerusalem into the wider Roman world. Revelation concludes with visions pointing beyond the brokenness of earthly systems toward ultimate restoration. Movement dominates the biblical narrative. Rarely does the story remain stationary for long. Because of this, the chosen repeatedly experience the pain of letting go before understanding where the road is ultimately leading. One of the most striking realities within biblical history is that loss often intensifies immediately before major transition. Israel approached the Promised Land only after decades of wilderness deaths. David approached kingship after years of pursuit and betrayal. The exile approached its conclusion only after generations passed in foreign lands. The early church expanded rapidly while persecution simultaneously increased. Scripture repeatedly presents moments where visible instability grows precisely because larger change is approaching. The chosen living inside those moments often cannot fully perceive the scale of what is happening around them. They only experience the immediate weight of uncertainty. Yet later generations looking backward can trace the progression clearly across maps, timelines, empires, migrations, and prophetic developments. This perspective transforms the biblical narrative into more than isolated stories of suffering. It becomes a sweeping historical record showing how transition repeatedly unfolds through separation and movement. Consider again the life of Joseph. For years his circumstances appeared fragmented beyond repair. Betrayed by brothers, transported to Egypt, enslaved in a foreign land, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, every stage looked disconnected from promise. Yet later, standing in Egypt during famine, the full historical movement became visible. The losses were connected to preservation extending beyond Joseph himself into future generations. Israel's eventual presence in Egypt emerged from that chain of events. The Exodus itself later emerged from Israel's growth there. Sinai, wilderness wandering, and eventual settlement in Canaan all trace backward toward earlier separations that once appeared meaningless in the moment. Scripture repeatedly reveals that the chosen often understand their losses only after enough historical distance exists to perceive the larger movement unfolding around them. Moses experienced this reality as well. Decades spent in Midian likely appeared disconnected from the destiny later associated with his name. Yet those hidden years shaped the man who would eventually confront Pharaoh, lead Israel, and guide a nation through wilderness territory. The chosen often spend long periods existing between visible chapters. One season has ended, another has not yet fully appeared. That middle territory becomes emotionally exhausting because certainty disappears there. The wilderness journeys recorded throughout Scripture capture this experience vividly. Deserts strip away illusions quickly. Water becomes precious. Direction becomes critical. Dependency becomes unavoidable. Yet the Bible repeatedly places transformation inside those harsh landscapes. Israel learned there. Elijah recovered there. John the Baptist emerged there. Jesus fasted there before beginning public ministry. The wilderness became symbolic of transition because it represented the painful space between loss and fulfillment. Even the closing prophetic visions of Revelation continue using geographical imagery shaped by movement and transformation. Seas roar, mountains shake, nations gather, Babylon falls. A new Jerusalem descends. History itself moves toward renewal after immense upheaval. The chosen throughout Scripture repeatedly stand inside turbulent transitions, while larger purposes unfold beyond immediate visibility. Their losses are never portrayed as pleasant or insignificant. Scripture records grief honestly. Tears appear throughout the biblical narrative. Lamentations mourn destroyed Jerusalem with devastating emotional clarity. The Psalms preserve cries from caves, battlefields, deserts, and exile. The Gospels preserve moments where even the closest followers of Jesus struggled under confusion, fear, and sorrow. Yet despite that emotional honesty, the biblical story never ultimately stops moving forward. Roads continue stretching toward the next destination. Kingdoms continue shifting. Prophetic timelines continue unfolding. The chosen continue walking through unfamiliar territory, carrying both grief and purpose simultaneously. This tension defines much of biblical history. The chosen lose constantly because history itself is constantly moving toward fulfillment through cycles of collapse, transition, refinement, and renewal. Scripture presents this not as cruelty, but as the reality of living within a world where earthly permanence cannot fully contain eternal purposes. Cities rise and fall. Generations appear and disappear. Nations expand and collapse. Yet the biblical narrative consistently points beyond temporary structures toward something lasting that remains ahead rather than behind. Because of this, the chosen are repeatedly pulled forward through transitions that require letting go of previous stages. Abraham could not remain in Ur. Israel could not remain in Egypt. The exiles could not remain forever in Babylon. The apostles could not remain hidden in Jerusalem. The movement of biblical history continually required departure before expansion. Constant loss became intertwined with calling because movement toward fulfillment demanded release from attachment to what could not continue into the next stage. Across Scripture, the chosen stand at the intersection between ending and beginning. They bury old seasons while walking toward unfamiliar territory. They mourn what disappears while history quietly unfolds beyond their immediate understanding. Mountains, deserts, seas, rivers, prisons, wilderness roads, ruined cities, and distant nations all become part of that unfolding story. The chosen endure constant loss because they are continually positioned near the front edge of historical transition, where old realities fade before new realities fully emerge. Their journeys reveal a pattern stretching from Genesis to Revelation. The road forward often passes directly through separation, uncertainty, displacement, and grief, before the wider purpose finally becomes visible across the full landscape of history.